For him, it's a pity he missed it because he would have had a good time. And it was nice to see people saying, well, after all that we've done, it's all it was, really. Get the lads here, give them a pat on the back and give them the medal.
Few stories in rock history are as intertwined with friendship and conflict as that of Paul McCartney and George Harrison. They started as boys from Liverpool dreaming of music, but fame and ambition forged a complicated bond filled with loyalty, tension, and unspoken regrets. What really happened between them when the Beatles were breaking apart? Decades later, Paul has finally opened up, shedding light on the silent struggles and deep admiration beneath the surface. This is the untold truth about a brotherhood tested by time, success, and eventual goodbye. Hidden tensions in a famous friendship. At first glance, the relationship between Paul McCartney and George Harrison seemed like a seamless brotherhood, forged in music and camaraderie. But beneath the surface, tensions simmered quietly for years, casting shadows over their public image as a tight-knit band. The pressures of fame and creative control silently reshaped a friendship that had once felt unbreakable. Paul, naturally confident and often taking the lead, grew into the driving force behind the Beatles' music and decisions. George, talented yet often overshadowed, struggled to find space for his own voice and vision within the group. Despite their early closeness, cracks began to show as their personalities and ambitions diverged. Paul's perfectionism and leadership style clashed with George's growing desire for artistic independence and spiritual exploration. These tensions weren't just professional, they cut deep into personal territory, evolving into years of silence and unresolved grievances. The world only saw the finished songs and performances, not the undercurrents of frustration and distance. What lay beneath was a complicated bond tangled in loyalty, resentment, and unspoken pain. The strain became increasingly visible during recording sessions, with Paul often directing others in ways that rubbed George the wrong way. At one point, George openly snapped at Paul, expressing that he would play only what pleased Paul or not at all. This moment was a rare glimpse into a friendship strained by creative dominance and a lack of mutual understanding. George's frustration was fueled by years of contributing songs that were sidelined, while Paul and John Lennon's compositions took center stage. This imbalance planted seeds of resentment that would take decades to address. Yet despite the silent distance growing between them, neither Paul nor George publicly voiced the full extent of their conflict for many years. Both men maintained a public facade of respect, though privately the relationship was far more complex. Their silence spoke volumes, carrying the weight of loyalty mingled with bitterness. Fans and outsiders sensed something unresolved, but the truth remained hidden beneath layers of fame and privacy. This ongoing tension was part of a larger story of ambition and brotherhood tested by unprecedented success. Paul's role as a band leader was often seen as overbearing, while George's quiet patience was mistaken for acceptance. But behind the scenes, the battle for creative space was fiercely real and deeply personal. The rivalry was less about hostility and more about a desperate need to be heard and valued in a band whose identity was evolving rapidly. Even as the Beatles' global fame skyrocketed, the relationship between Paul and George became a balancing act of collaboration and competition. They shared history, but growing apart emotionally created a distance few could bridge. Yet, paradoxically, that distance made their bond more fragile, not easily broken, but full of cracks. This fragile state set the stage for moments of both confrontation and reluctant reconciliation years later. Importantly, the dynamic between Paul and George was not one-dimensional. Despite tensions, Paul remained George's mentor and champion in many ways, especially early on. That duality created confusion and complexity, with moments of brotherly support often interrupted by power struggles and silent disagreements. The story of their friendship was a story of contrasts, harmony shadowed by discord. As time passed and the Beatles' story unfolded, Paul's eventual willingness to break his silence about George reveals the emotional depth behind their fraught relationship. It opens a window into the struggles, regrets, and affection that coexisted quietly for decades. Their story is a reminder that beneath legendary music, icons are real human relationships shaped by conflicting desires and unresolved emotions. These hidden tensions formed the hidden thread that would eventually unravel and later mend, but never fully disappear. Now, to understand how this complicated friendship began, we must go back to Liverpool and the earliest days that bonded them beyond music. Early bonds in Liverpool. Long before the Beatles became an unstoppable global phenomenon, Paul McCartney and George Harrison's friendship took root in the streets and schools of Liverpool. Their connection began as early as 1954, when they both attended the Liverpool Institute High School for Boys. Paul was older by a year, already known for his quick wit and musical curiosity, while George was quieter, often struggling to fit into a rigid school environment he disliked. The two rarely bonded over academics, but that was hardly where the real connection lay. The friendship between them developed during their extended bus rides, which took them to the city. Paul used his guitar to connect with others who wanted to spend time with him outside their school uniform restrictions and social separation. George saw Paul with the instrument, and they started a music discussion that lasted for 3 hours because they both loved music that existed outside their age gap. The two people developed a shared interest in the skiffle craze, which spread across the United States because it introduced an energizing yet simple musical style that motivated many young musicians to begin playing instruments. The two boys developed their early music preferences through their fascination with American rock and roll stars, who included Elvis Presley, Buddy Holly, and Little Richard. The raw musical energy of Heartbreak Hotel impressed George because this song created a strong impact, which inspired him to practice guitar more. During school, he used his notebooks to create instrument drawings, which he practiced until his fingertips became sore from the effort. The young person developed a strong enthusiasm that later turned into his lifelong commitment to music. Paul developed his musical skills through family connections with his father, Jim McCartney, who conducted a jazz band. Paul had learned piano through official training when he first met George, while already starting his guitar career. Paul recognized George's dedication to his work, which showed him that the younger boy would succeed because of his skills. The two friends developed a deep connection because their mutual love of music created an immediate bond between them. By 1956, George was part of a local skiffle group called the Rebels, showing early signs of his determination to make music more than just a hobby. Paul had joined John Lennon's band, the Quarrymen, in 1957, which began a musical partnership that would reshape the future of music. Paul believed that George possessed enough talent to become the band's second guitarist when they required another guitarist. John Lennon hesitated because he thought George was too young and looked too baby-faced to fit in with the Beatles. George's musicianship stood out as his greatest musical achievement. George played a perfect version of the rockabilly instrumental Raunchy on a Liverpool bus, which created his decisive moment. The band accepted him into their group after he proved his skill, which completed their essential trio. The three musicians became tight friends through their common interest in music, which led them to spend numerous hours together playing chords while they created song ideas about what should come next after their life in Liverpool. For Paul, who lost his mother when he was 14, this friendship offered him support and gave him a reason to live. George received confirmation of his status as an equal musician to veteran artists through this experience. The remarkable journey from that first bus ride to the heights of Beatlemania reveals how deeply intertwined their stories were from the start. Rise of the Beatles and shifting dynamics. The Beatles' unprecedented rise from Liverpool club favorites to global superstars brought enormous pressure on both the band and the relationships within it. By the mid-1960s, Paul McCartney had naturally taken a leading role as the band's creative driving force. His vision, perfectionism, and relentless work ethic shaped much of their sound and direction. This transformation, however, left George Harrison increasingly marginalized. As Paul's influence grew, so did George's frustration. He was no longer just the quiet one or the skilled guitarist in the background. George was evolving into a confident songwriter with a distinct voice. Yet, the Lennon-McCartney partnership dominated Beatles' releases and sessions, often leaving George's compositions overlooked or restricted. This imbalance began to strain more than just studio schedules. It affected their personal rapport as well. The moment this tension became most visible came with the making of the groundbreaking 1967 album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. The album was widely viewed as Paul's vision, a carefully orchestrated project pushing the boundaries of rock music. George's spiritual exploration surfaced in the song Within You Without You, a deeply personal piece reflecting his immersion in Indian music and philosophy. To Paul and the rest, George's track was just another song on a larger concept album, but to George, it was profoundly significant, a symbol of his quest for meaning beyond commercial success. Their differing priorities began to clash subtly but persistently. While Paul focused on records and business, George searched for a spiritual path, setting the stage for growing distance. This divergence came to a head during the Beatles' famous trip to India in early 1968. George fully embraced meditation and spirituality as life-changing, while Paul treated the experience more casually, seeing it as a break from musical work. Paul's later attempt to joke with George, "Calm down, Georgie boy," highlighted the gulf between them. For George, this was no joking matter. The Beatles' obsession with success and endless recording distracted George from the spiritual journey he believed was essential to his well-being. Frustration mounted as Paul's determination to steer the group's direction left little room for George's growing artistic or personal expression. Over time, this imbalance deepened the fissures between them. George's songwriting during this period quietly flourished, producing songs filled with emotional depth and introspection. However, many of these compositions were pushed aside or deemed secondary in the Beatles' sessions. Paul's dominance and the band's internal politics compounded George's sense of exclusion. The growing divide foreshadowed later breaking points in their relationship. The shift in creative power dynamics not only challenged George's role in the band, but also tested the very friendship he shared with Paul. The foundation they built in Liverpool began to buckle under the strain of ambition and differing priorities. As years passed and those tensions reached a breaking point, the coming chapter would shake the band and redefine their relationships forever. The breakpoint of 1969. By 1969, the Beatles' once tight-knit brotherhood had frayed under the weight of creative conflict and personal frustration. Tensions that had long simmered reached a boiling point during the recording sessions for what would become the Let It Be album. Cameras captured moments that revealed a band no longer united, especially between Paul McCartney and George Harrison. Paul frequently took charge in the studio, often directing others in ways that seemed to stifle George's creative freedom. One particularly telling moment saw George snap at Paul, saying, "I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all if you don't want me to. Whatever it is that will please you, I'll do it." This raw exchange was more than a quarrel. It was years of pent-up frustration spilling over. George had evolved into a confident songwriter, but Paul's controlling approach left little room for George's talents to flourish within the band's framework. George built up a secretive music collection, which included his song creations and 3 tracks which included All Things Must Pass, Isn't It a Pity, and Run of the Mill. The Beatles used to reject these songs because they preferred to work on Lennon-McCartney songs. The band recorded all their music through Paul and John, which created a system that George started to experience as unbearable. The two friends developed increasing hostility towards each other because they ignored him. George reached his breaking point on January 10, 1969. The rehearsals started to become unbearable for him, so he decided to leave. He later described the environment as very unhealthy and unhappy for him to stay. The band members recognized their fragile unity after George left because John Lennon had previously threatened to quit the band without actually following through. The Beatles needed to retrieve George because he served as their lead guitarist, who maintained essential equilibrium within their fragile group dynamics. George stayed away for 12 days before he returned, but the deep fracture lines between them remained unhealed. George composed Wah Wah on the day he left the band to express his feelings about the tense atmosphere that Paul created through his dominant behavior. Paul showed his complicated view of George Harrison's songwriting success through a private meeting, which writer Anthony Fawcett recorded later that same year. Paul told John Lennon that their songs had outperformed George's music until recent times, but now George's music matched their level of quality. George dismissed this as a myth, reminding them that he had been writing those songs for years. Their emotional distance from each other produced a sharp contrast, which showed how they viewed the situation. Paul saw George as a late bloomer, someone who arrived way behind Lennon and McCartney's prolific songwriting. George, however, saw Paul as unwilling to share creative space and credit. This fundamental disconnect fed the ongoing rivalry and deepened the emotional wounds. The friendship, though tied by history, was undeniably damaged in a way that would shadow both men. George's solo work acquired its powerful emotional impact from this time of conflict, which created hidden emotional tensions. All Things Must Pass, which he released in 1970, included Run of the Mill, which had lyrics that seemed to address Paul directly with lines like, "You've got me wondering how I lost your friendship." The scars of their strained relationship had found an outlet in music, a creative way to process a fractured bond. Even as George was dealing with his departure and private struggles, the world awaited what would soon become a landmark moment of artistic vindication. Abbey Road and creative vindication. 1969 was a tumultuous year, but it also brought one of George Harrison's crowning achievements within the Beatles. When the group came together to record Abbey Road, George emerged with some of the album's most memorable and celebrated songs. Here Comes the Sun and Something stood out not only for their beauty, but for the statement they made. George had arrived as a major creative force in his own right. Something especially became iconic, with Frank Sinatra later calling it the greatest love song ever written. Even John Lennon remarked that it was the best track on the album. For George, this recognition was a vindication of years spent in the shadows, validating his talent beyond just being the band's guitarist. The success of these songs marked a subtle but significant shift in the Beatles' creative dynamics. Yet behind the scenes, the shift brought more tension than comfort. George resented Paul's constant interference in arrangements, feeling that Paul often underestimated his discipline and commitment to refining his ideas. Although their work during the Abbey Road sessions was professional, their personal relationship was far from warm. Conversations were sparse, with music speaking louder than words. Paul, meanwhile, saw the rising profile of George's songwriting as a challenge to his leadership role within the band. The power balance was shifting, and it stirred up anxiety and conflict beneath the surface. Even though Abbey Road would be the Beatles' last recorded album together, the cracks in their relationships had become impossible to ignore. The album's release in September 1969 came when the Beatles were already unraveling. Behind the music's brilliance was a band fractured by competing visions, unspoken resentments, and emotional distance. It was the end of an era. The breakup officially followed in 1970, each member ready to pursue their own path. George advanced his career without delay. In 1970, George released All Things Must Pass, which contained 3 albums that displayed his musical skills to listeners through its extensive tracks. The work showed his development from being a Beatles performer into becoming an artist and songwriter who had gained musical progress. Paul started his individual music career by releasing the album McCartney, which he followed by establishing the band Wings. The Beatles disbanded permanently, yet their competitive spirit between them continued to exist. Paul and George built individual professional paths that demonstrated their ability to achieve success independently from each other. The two men maintained an irregular friendship throughout the 1970s, which included periods of frosty interactions. George said that he found Paul to be too dominant for him to handle, and he expressed his desire to perform with John Lennon while excluding Paul. Paul managed to act normally in front of people who made negative remarks about him because he found their comments to be extremely painful. The situation between the two men seemed to improve because George extended an invitation to Paul for the concert for Bangladesh, which took place in 1971. Paul rejected the invitation because he needed to solve logistical problems, which caused the public opportunity for healing to vanish. From these cracks in the Beatles' legacy would gradually emerge a more mature understanding, though not without its own difficulties. Post-Beatles rivalry and distance. After the Beatles officially disbanded in 1970, Paul McCartney and George Harrison set out on distinctly separate solo paths, each defining his own musical and personal identity. Though their careers flourished individually, George with his deeply spiritual and sonically rich albums, and Paul with his commercially successful projects, the lingering tension between them was unmistakable. Their personal relationship, once close, drifted into sporadic and sometimes chilly interactions. The warmth they had shared in their youth was often replaced with guarded distance. George showed his true feelings towards Paul, who had an overwhelming personality. George stated in his interviews that he would play in a band with John Lennon again, but he found it impossible to imagine doing the same with Paul. Their open statements showed that their past conflicts had created strong bonds between them. Paul found the comments challenging to understand because he showed no difficulty handling them in public. The unresolved matters between them became evident because the secret pain remained within him. The two sides could not reach an understanding because their conflicts blocked any opportunity for peace. George invited Paul to join him in the first concert for Bangladesh because this event showed George's commitment to helping others. Paul, however, declined the invitation, citing concerns about logistics. Their different needs pushed them apart, while this absence created a bigger gap between them. George dedicated his time to spiritual matters and his solo career throughout the 1970s while he practiced Hindu meditation and studied its teachings. Paul, unlike George, chased after commercial success through the creation of Wings, which earned him international fame. Their different musical paths showed more than their distinct musical styles because they displayed different ways of living and building their legacies. The two people who shared a past with mutual respect kept their connection, which remained delicate. The Beatles' legacy remained significant among them, even though their contact with each other decreased. The two men proved their ability to achieve success by themselves, yet their competition and their complex bond remained intact. The couple maintained distant yet connected relations, which included competitive behavior, but also mutual admiration. The relationship between these two people developed through their shared historical background together. George spent the decade demonstrating his authentic emotional state toward Paul, while Paul slowly started to appreciate George's artistic talent. Paul began to recognize George's songwriting ability through public statements about his work, which he described as a late bloomer who created some of the most exceptional songs of their time. This admission indicated growing maturity and a softened perspective, though it did not erase past wounds. The 1970s established the foundation for Paul and George's future relationship, which included elements of caution and collaboration while displaying intricate relationship dynamics. The two men had transformed from former bandmates into two people who needed to resolve their shared victories and defeats, which had happened during their long relationship. Their story showed how friendships that last a lifetime can survive through various transformations yet maintain their core. That thread of connection, though tangled with old wounds, was about to pull them back together for a brief but meaningful reunion. The 1990s reunion and fragile truce. By the early 1990s, time and circumstance had softened some of the animosity and distance between Paul McCartney and George Harrison. On February 11, 1994, the two reunited with Ringo Starr at Paul's studio to work on unfinished John Lennon demos. This collaboration, dubbed the Threepenny or the Threedles by the press, stirred excitement among fans who thought a Beatles resurrection was impossible. However, beneath the surface of this momentous project, old dynamics quietly resurfaced. George arrived at the sessions with firm ideas and insisted on bringing in his friend Jeff Lynne to produce the tracks. He cautioned Paul that without an external hand, the sessions could spiral into chaos. Paul later acknowledged it was George who said, "No, we need a producer. It could be dangerous just to get in the studio. Could get nasty. You've got egos flying around." These words reflected not only concern for the music, but also the complicated history of egos and friction among them. The collaboration produced two songs, Free as a Bird and Real Love, but the artists faced multiple conflicts throughout their work. Paul wanted the songs to have an authentic Beatles sound, but George preferred musical elements that were simple and contained hidden melodies. The two artists parted ways during their disagreement about vocal performances and songwriting because their artistic differences had not changed after 30 years. The two parties reached their work conclusion, which resulted in new musical material that acted as a link between historical times and current times. Their friendship outside of the recording studio became unsafe, yet it sustained their connection. George displayed his genuine emotions whenever he met others, while he told people that Paul made him feel overwhelmed. The two men shared a lengthy partnership, yet they both understood that their connection could not be broken. Paul started to recognize George's abilities as a songwriter because he publicly declared that he had underestimated George during their time with the Beatles. George encountered significant health problems during the period after the band reunited. He received a throat cancer diagnosis in 1997, which was later followed by his battle with lung cancer and a brain tumor, which led him to live a more peaceful existence. George survived a brutal knife attack at his residence in 1999, which made him weaker, yet his spiritual strength remained unbroken. Paul spent time with George during his difficult period, and their relationship strengthened as George approached his final days. Their last meetings were marked by a tenderness not often displayed in their earlier years. Paul recalled sitting by George's side for hours in a New York hospital, joking about silly things as if they were kids again. At one point, they even held hands, an unthinkable gesture in their youth, which symbolized the healing of old wounds and the enduring bond beneath it all. George's passing in 2001 at age 58 left Paul devastated. Not just the loss of a bandmate, but the death of a lifelong friend and brother-in-arms. In the years since, Paul has found ways to honor George's memory, from whispering greetings to a tree George planted near his home to nurturing the friendship between their children. Even after decades of distance and disagreement, their bond proved unbreakable, reminding us that sometimes the deepest connections persist beyond conflict and time. Final years and lasting legacy. As the 1990s progressed, George Harrison faced a series of daunting health challenges that would ultimately shape the final chapter of his life. Diagnosed with throat cancer in 1997, he battled the disease with resilience, later confronting lung cancer and a brain tumor. These illnesses gradually confined him to a quieter existence, far removed from the frenetic pace of his Beatles and solo career days. Despite this, George's spiritual strength and artistic spirit remained unbroken, remaining a defining feature of his character until the end. The year 1999 brought tragedy when George emerged from his Friar Park home knife attack. His physical condition suffered multiple setbacks, but his experience strengthened his determination and expanded his understanding of spirituality. Despite his deteriorating health, George's artistic output didn't cease. He continued to create music, even recording in the quiet solitude of his home, making music that reflected his deepening spiritual journey and introspection. His work during these final years was a testament to his enduring creativity, with the posthumous release of his album Brainwashed in 2002 serving as a poignant reminder of his talent and legacy. Paul McCartney visited George when he could, their relationship evolving into one of quiet support and mutual respect. Their visits strengthened their relationship because the two men shared an emotional connection that developed between them after spending years apart from each other. Their final meetings became personal moments that exposed their friendship through dark times, because they had experienced tough times yet maintained their bond. Paul described his time next to George in a New York hospital, where they spent their day together, joking and sharing stories, which brought them back to their childhood friendship. The two men showed their affection for each other through hand-holding, which they had never done during their years growing up in Liverpool. The moment represented a healing process that overcame a conflict that had existed for many years. George Harrison died in the 58th year of his life on November 29, 2001. His death represented a major loss because he had smoked for his entire life, and he died after spending his final years in poor health. George's ashes were cremated and scattered in the sacred waters of the Ganges and Yamuna rivers, honoring his long-standing devotion to Hindu spirituality and reflecting the deep personal beliefs that had guided much of his life and music. His passing left a lasting mark on both his family and the world, as George was known not only for his musical contributions, but for his profound influence on spirituality, culture, and humanitarian work. His legacy as a pioneering musician, spiritual seeker, and compassionate individual continues to resonate with generations of fans. Paul McCartney's reflections reveal a bond with George Harrison that went far beyond music. marked by rivalry, respect, and deep brotherhood. Their story teaches us about the complexity of human relationships amid fame and fortune. If you enjoyed this look into their lives, please like and subscribe for more fascinating music history stories.